Greetings, dear listeners, and welcome back to our NATO 75th anniversary podcast, NATO Through Time, where for some months now already, and I very much hope, dear audience, that you've been following the previous episodes, we've been looking at crucial moments that have shaped the Atlantic Alliance as we know it today, in the company of special guests. And today we have a very special guest because I'm delighted to welcome here the former president of Finland, Sauli Niinistö. He was president of Finland from 2012 to 2024. But prior to becoming president, he had a long and distinguished career, as you would expect in Finnish politics. He was Speaker of the Parliament, Minister of Finance, Minister of Justice, and he was in situ during those crucial years when Finland came very close to NATO and close enough that it eventually became, in 2023, a NATO member, number 31, to be joined very soon thereafter, this year, by its neighbour, Sweden. So today, in the company of President Niinistö, we want to very much look at the Finnish path to NATO. Why did it happen? How did it happen? Mr. President, also, of course, always welcome your own personal thoughts and recollections on all of these issues. As somebody who was not an observer but a player making it all happening, how you experienced all of this and what you felt at the time and how you feel about it now is something which I know the listeners would be greatly interested in indeed. So thank you very much for being here today in the studio at NATO headquarters. First, to kick us off, could you say something about your early years leading up to the time when you first became a member of Parliament in Finland? Formative years. What got you involved in politics? What did you set out to do? Did you take an interest early on? I mean, you were Minister of Finance and Minister of Justice, but did you take an interest early on in the sort of foreign policy issues, which you became famous later? And what was the perception of NATO that you had in a neutral country like Finland back in those early Cold War days?
I guess I must have heard about NATO during the Cuban crisis.
1962.
Yeah, and well, let's say it became more familiar to me in 60s. I learned to know what is NATO and what it is doing. I was educated to be a judge. I served in Court of Appeal in Finland more than 12 years. Well, did I have an idea of entering to politics? Not necessarily. I really liked my work, but nevertheless, at the time, I have an old tradition of conservative family, and when I was asked to some city council elections, I said, why not? And that, in a way, led me little by little, deeper to politics and then to Finnish Parliament. Actually, I wasn't that much involved in foreign policy. In early 90s, discussion on European Union rose in Finland, and I was surely very pro. We should become a member in European family, like we called it at the time. And maybe we have to notice that somehow this procedure was linked also to our security thinking. Many of us, including me, thought that, well, this is a step towards a more secure future. And especially when we joined EMU, I was at the time already Minister of Finance, and I'm heavily blamed because of that nowadays. But nevertheless, I remember a poll in Finland before we made the final decision, and people were asked whether they see that joining the EMU would somehow increase our security. And 60% said yes.
Right. So economic security was part of security overall.
Well, same currency. Yeah. Same currency somehow led to that kind of thinking. But 92, 93, we had a huge purchase buying Hornets from USA.
Yep, military fighter jets.
Yes, more than 60, which was the, clearly biggest operation in money never done in Finland. And I remember the discussion whether we can, it was a very bad time in our finances. Suddenly finds, was it, tens of billions of Finnish mark at the moment when we were lending money a lot to maintain the activities of the society. So it was a very difficult issue. And I would say that it was a kind of a clear message for ourselves, for outside world, yes. Earlier on we had been flying with MiGs, Russian-made or Soviet-made, and now suddenly American Hornets, and a big amount of them.
Yeah.
So I would say that on security policy, that was maybe the biggest step in 90s.
Mr. President, I imagine that if you're an effective finance minister for your country, you're bound to be unpopular. That's in the nature of the job. But it's very interesting that you see, the economic decisions on procurement going from old Soviet to American fighters is also marking a kind of geopolitical shift as well. But back in those days, people in the security policy world used to talk about Finlandisation. I don't think it was a particularly nice or polite term, because I know as a historian that Finland always fiercely defended its independence, particularly during the Second World War, was always a very firm democracy anchored in the values of the West. But how did you sort of experience nonetheless what people referred to as Finlandisation? Was it very difficult doing this balancing act at the time during the Cold War between Russia on the one hand and the West on the other? And can I add a question there, Mr. President? Did you feel that, being in this sort of special position, geographically, geopolitically, that it gave Finland advantages? For example, a bridge builder. Everybody of my generation remembers the Helsinki Final Act, of course, back in the 70s when Finland was the venue where East and West came together. So could you talk a little bit about, that particular sort of concept of Finlandisation? Even if both of us probably would agree that it's not the most polite term to use.
Yes, I have no difficulties with that. Actually, it was originally Finlandisation. It came from Germany. I came to Parliament 1987, and I would say that the time was over then. It actually was, and I accept the expression Finlandisering, that was more on 60s, 70s, and what it meant. Usually they say that, yes, Kremlin, Moscow, was dictating. Maybe a bit. But we saw in Finland some Finnish politicians, they were smelling the air and understood that I might very well whisper, what might they think about this in Moscow? So some Finns actually created the worst of Finlandisering by themselves to get some advantage of that. But, for example, my party, that was the National Coalition Party, we were out of government up to 87. And the reason, very obviously, was that they wouldn't like to have us in Kremlin, in government. So that is the story about that. Advantage, yes, you referred to 75 huge meeting, which, actually was maybe more successful than it seemed at the time.
Absolutely.
Because later on in 90s, the countries behind the Iron Curtain, they said that, well, we had in Helsinki 75, we decided actually that every nation has a right to do what they think that is best for them.
It was also, Mr. President, armed neutrality, wasn't it? I mean, it wasn't neutrality in the sense that a country doesn't have an army or a defence force and tries to stay completely out of international affairs. You had this history with Russia. You fought them twice with great bravery in the Second World War. And so you as finance minister, I imagine, had to sort of see quite a lot of your money or the country's money going into security and defence.
Yeah.
You had this enormous reserve force, which are something that many NATO countries today very much envy. Can you say something about how you saw this sort of concept of armed neutrality and what it meant in practical terms? You mentioned, of course, buying American fighter jets, for instance.
There's a wisdom in Finland, and that is that a Cossack, and that means Russian soldier, takes everything which is loose. And this story dates back for centuries. We have been fighting with them during all our history. And I think I like to talk about national memory, which is in backbone. And this is one of them. So even though especially during President Kekkonen time, it seemed that, we are good friends with the Soviet Union and Russians. We maintained all the time conscription, and this kind of element was existing in our backbone. Almost everybody, let's say, had it, but it was kind of hidden.
But did the Finnish population sort of support this in terms of conscription, obviously patriotic sort of duty to defend the country and the rest? Did it cost you a lot of money, did you did you ever think in those days, well, it would be great if we could be in NATO because maybe we could share the burden a little bit and it might be cheaper for us?
It would have been cheaper, yes. For example, Hornets hardly were bought if we had been a member of NATO. Yeah. We would have said, like I have heard some people saying in Europe, that, it's the NATO. So I don't remember a very serious attempt to give up conscription ever. So when I did my duty, actually, surely it was kind of terrible. We lived in tents during the winter time for 1 month, everything like that. But the result is that I happened to meet one of those boys who were at the same time. It was almost 60 years. And I immediately knew. He asked me, do you know me? I said, yes. We hadn't seen meanwhile. So it is a deep, deep experience. And I have always said that, it is important that you learn to shoot and even fight in war, but maybe even more important is social cohesion, which you create by conscription. Yeah. And I believe that the Finnish model you refer to trusting each other, building a kind of whole of society system in that very, very largely is based on trusting each other, and the trust comes often from conscription.
So conscription is that building block of young people from different areas of the country, and maybe different classes of society, different backgrounds.
Totally different.
In the same boat, as it were, for
yes. And now that girls are there too, on voluntary basis.
We come to 1989, the Berlin Wall comes down, it's the end of the Cold War. Can you describe for me a little bit how you, as a leading figure in Finland, sort of experienced that in terms of where the country would go? Did you say, aha, the Cold War is over, so now we will turn entirely to the West? Or no, the Cold War is over, but we should remain still a well, we call it now more non-aligned than the phrase neutral. You mentioned at the beginning of our conversation all the work you had to do as finance minister bringing Finland into the European Union. Was the choice of the EU a sense that, well, it's better for us than NATO, or it's going to be easier for us than NATO, or if we are in the EU, we don't need NATO in terms of security? Some countries decided to go for NATO first, others like Finland and Sweden, obviously the EU option. So I think our listeners would really be very interested to hear a little bit about, with the Cold War over, which new sort of strategic directions you took and why you felt that those were the best choices.
Well, it was a big jump, however, to enter to EU. And I think that most of us thought that, well, it is an important step towards West, and now we are part of West forever, being a member in EU. And maybe the question of NATO was in a way pushed aside because we have done it already with EU, at least most of that. And we have to say that Russia in the beginning of 90s wasn't very frightening. So
because of the unpredictability, with the coups against Gorbachev, the coup against Yeltsin, and the rest.
It seemed to be very mixed up. The only fear we actually had is that when refugees come from Russia, thousands, tens of thousands maybe, to Finland, that was the main problem at that time.
When it comes to Russia, you have a deep understanding of Russia. You were famous within NATO before Finland joined, but I can tell you this as on the international staff here at NATO at the time as somebody who had this good insight with Russia. And when you phoned the Kremlin, they picked up the phone. And I recall you did a lot of work before Russia invaded Ukraine back in 2022 to try to sort of have greater confidence in the Baltics. You remember the work on air traffic safety and the transponders of military aircraft to make sure that they were switched on and transmitting signals so that we could avoid the prevention of incidents. Can you tell us a little bit about how you saw your role and Finland's role still as that bridge builder between NATO and Russia before you, of course, became a NATO member?
There were some principles I had in 2012 when I started. First was that we have to get to same level as Sweden in our Western relations. I had read a book, a Swedish book about history, short history from Kennedy time and so on, and I somehow started to think that, okay, now in the States they think that Sweden is the castle and we are the area of the castle, and defending castle starts, I don't know the word in English, pre-area or whatever.
That's it. Yeah. Yes.
And but the main target to defend is Sweden.
Just backtracking just slightly back to the end of the Cold War period. Finland did not opt for NATO membership at that time. Obviously, non-alignment had worked very successfully for you, like for other countries in Europe. And I imagine when something works successfully, there's a political public desire to stick with it as long as it's feasible. But you did join NATO's Partnership for Peace. And for many years, you were the super partner, we used to call you here, along with Sweden, in terms of...
From 2014.
Being super active in so many of its mechanisms. Can I ask you, to just sort of put your memory back to those days, around the turn of the century. What was it about the partnership that you found particularly attractive? And was it controversial in Finland when Finland decided to join the Partnership for Peace? Did some politicians say, this is the back door to NATO membership, we shouldn't go there? Or was this really seen as a good sort of formula for you to could be connected to NATO without the necessity of joining the alliance?
Somehow it was kind of natural and I think most of the even members in parliament thought in that way. It was another step towards West, and enhanced partner 2014, that was very natural. It was not that much discussed, or there was not a huge dispute. Maybe people concentrated more on the EU process because there was quite tight voting at the end.
Yeah.
So even those who were even against EU, they might have thought that, well, the NATO, we concentrate now against EU. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, but was there a sense also, you were talking about Putin as well, that somehow non-alignment was best for your security because it would still allow you to balance your anchoring in the West with relations with Russia?
There was a group of people who thought approximately same as in Sweden, that, well, staying non-aligned gives us a possibility of staying aside of problems.
Yeah.
Then there was another group who were afraid of Russia, that if we move, so what will happen? And then third group, a minor group, who were pro-Russians, and or let's say had some sympathy towards Russia, and surely they didn't want to join anything. But a bit later, let's say when I took office as president, I saw that not that we have to be on same level than Sweden, but we can't do anything without Sweden, because if you look at the map, our membership without Sweden would have seemed a bit risky.
Yeah, and more difficult for NATO to defend. Not that NATO can't do it, but
it would have been
it makes it more difficult.
Different, in a way, island, far away from everything else. But yes, something like this, I would say.
For many years, as Finland was in NATO's Partnership for Peace, it became very active. It participated in NATO exercises, the NATO response force. You sent forces to the Balkans, I think Afghanistan as well.
Yeah.
Was that accepted by Finnish public opinion, or was it seen as a sort of a bit of a compromise on non-alignment? Because you know, here people said even before you joined NATO that in many respects you acted, behaved, spoke just like an ally. If I closed my eyes and listened to the Finnish ambassador at a NATO meeting, it would be difficult to distinguish between what she or he was saying. And many NATO members, we were so integrated in the form of values even then.
The Afghanistan, that raised questions and discussions, but nevertheless, even that was a clear majority ready to do that. I would say that it was a feeling that we have to be fair with NATO, so something like that, I would say.
So you wanted, even in those days, to be a provider of security and
in
not
a way,
just a consumer. When Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, you said that cooperation with NATO was stepped up. In which sense do you mean that?
We increased a lot common exercises with NATO. In 2014, we decided the program for 15, and that was heavily increased.
We now come, of course, to the big issue to discuss. Now, of course, we come to that decisive turning point where partnership is not enough any longer, and you seek membership. So, and public opinion and political opinion turns around almost overnight. Was it just the shock of everybody invasion of Ukraine back in February 2022? Was that the only thing, or given what you were saying earlier about the EU cooperation with Sweden, Nordic cooperation, was there also a growing sense in Finland? Well, these things are okay. Being in the EU, having cooperation with our Nordic partners, having good bilateral relations, but they're not enough. We need something else. Only NATO is the gold standard, sort of thing.
Let's look back first up to 2021. Very seldom heard any Finn saying that I'm against NATO. No. But do we have to join? Well, we do not have a specific need to join. Yeah. That was the common position. But then, that was end of November 21. Putin gave a speech to 3 ambassadors in Kremlin. I heard about that. And he said in that speech first time that NATO, they demand that NATO will not enlarge anymore, and that deals with all the bordering countries.
Including, of course, Finland.
Including Finland. I reacted immediately, and I gave to Finnish media a statement that Finland will do what Finland wants to do. So that was the answer to Russians. Then they continued it, and I had a speech first traditional speech in New Year's Day, 22. And then I said a bit more than that we are not any safe area, or the Russian interest sphere is not in Finland. And why? They, in a way, jumped to our territory, in our integrity, in a way. First time in my... So far they had always said that yes, Finland and Sweden will join NATO, we will give an answer, a proper answer, and they were telling what it would be. But then they started suddenly to say that no, they will demand that you will. That was totally different, and from that point,
compromise on your sovereignty.
Yeah. And from that point, I realized that. By the way, in January, I heard Lavrov getting back to the old saying that if Finland and Sweden join the NATO, they will react. So it was mild in a way, a bit. But the accident had already happened, because what I was thinking is that, well, later on, if I say that, well, Finns didn't want to join the NATO, everybody would have, yes, sure, and they would have thought that, well, Russians forbid you.
Yeah.
So that was a change.
Yeah, it was a kind of point where you had to assert your independence.
They changed our position.
Ah, right.
Yeah. And then little by little, also the support of NATO started to go upwards. Then surely a crucial moment was their attack to Ukraine, full-scale attack. Then the opinion polls jumped.
Yeah.
But there was the basement already. Hey, they have been trying to hurt our independence and our integrity. Yeah. That changed quite a lot.
Because one thing Finns are very firmly attached to, it's their independence and integrity. You've had to fight for them in recent history, as we were saying earlier. So
they were holy things.
You know what that's about. we get the impression sometimes here in Brussels that the whole process was incredibly smooth. Public opinion, no debate whatsoever, sort of thing. The process of negotiating the terms of accession with NATO incredibly smooth. Was that the reality? Not asking you for any indiscretions, Mr. President, but were there some bumps in the road, both in terms of parliamentary support in Finland, or when you came to NATO and had to sort of talk hard things, bases, finance, troop stationing, obligations, that you can share with us, with our listeners?
From beginning of March 22, I consider that it is most important that the Parliament will have a thorough discussion on the issue, so that nobody can say later on that I didn't know, or there was a risk that our final membership would take place and the voting in Parliament after elections. So at least I wanted to make it sure that everybody involved, every party involved, is deep on pro to that decision. And finally, 94% of Finnish Parliament voted yes.
That's good.
So, yes, 94. And there was surely that 6% they were against, but not a big debate. But the most exciting moments were surely the Turkish, and that was one of the most difficult places, because we had all the time with our foreign minister a keen contact. He with his colleague in Ankara, and my cabinet with the president's cabinet, and we received a bit different kind of information from Turkey, which in the end of the year 2022 was a bit such that if you say that you separate Sweden, so we might give a green light to you, but you have to say it yourself. Sweden is, and we refused.
Yeah, because as you were saying, you always saw Sweden and Finland strategically, as well as in values and democracy, belonging together.
Yes,
and you coordinated, I imagine, very closely, right, with Stockholm throughout the entire exercise.
Yes, and like we said earlier, said that Finnish membership without Sweden, I said it publicly, is incomplete, not good. So that was. Well, we had to be careful that Turks don't say that Finland is refusing, which they, in a way, played a bit to that direction. But at the end, it was actually solved so that they proposed that if I come to Ankara, you will be accepted. And I said, I will come to Ankara, but you have to accept us before that, so that there's no impression that we are leaving Swedes behind.
No, that was important because they had arguably greater bilateral issues with Turkey at that particular time, although they were fortunately resolved. But a year later, so staying with Sweden was obviously, as a future ally, was particularly important in helping them and helping, I imagine, Turkey to resolve those issues and get Sweden over the line. Yes, and we have to keep in mind that most of the existing NATO members had an idea that they come together. Yeah. It was very much so, always.
Yes, especially in USA, it was like a given thing together. So that was a bit difficult, but now everything is okay.
Finland has today become the 31st member of NATO. The era of military non-alignment in our history has come to an end. A new era begins. Each country maximizes its own security. So does Finland. NATO membership strengthens our international position and room for maneuver. As a partner, We have already long actively participated in NATO activities. As an ally, Finland will contribute to NATO's collective deterrence and defense.
What's your sense now that Finland has been in NATO for a year plus as an ally? Do you sense in terms of defence, exercises, activities, commitments, a big difference from the days when you were an active partner? What have been the major differences? And what do you think Finland is giving to NATO? And how do you feel NATO has come to the defence of Finland since you became an ally? Because being an ally does change things, right? There's the Article 5 commitment. There's more of a commitment to solidarity. And that means NATO doing things to Finland to show that it's serious, and Finland showing the rest of the alliance that it's there as an ally. So it'd be good to get your sense in what's been happening over the last year and how you think it's all going.
Surely we have seen a lot more NATO troops present and exercises, even though we had them earlier on quite a lot also. So it's not totally new, but not a new phenomenon, but, the amount is different. I guess that now the feeling that we would be alone somewhere, that has gone. What Finland means to NATO, we are, I would say, proportionally thought, taking notice to our size, maybe number one in Europe. Mm-hmm. I would rather see that we wouldn't be, that others would have been on same or even higher level. But that comes now, and also in my recent task as a reporter, Europe is not at all strong enough. It's been forgotten that security is most important value that a person can have, because without security, if you're insecure,
you can't deliver the other things, can you?
Nothing.
Yes.
Yeah. So, but it has been so self-evident, and you don't see actually your security, but you feel if you don't have it. Yeah. So we should have such a feeling all over Europe to understand and be getting a bit better.
Mr. President, that brings us to the final part of our conversation. You're in Brussels today to present your report on the EU security and resilience to President Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the Commission. This is part of a series of reports that we've had over the last couple of months on the future of the EU. But at NATO, your one, obviously on security, on resilience, is the one that will be read very, very, very closely indeed. This obviously has been a big task because both at NATO and the EU, we do have not just the problem of preventing traditional war with tanks and missiles and millions of troops, but also making sure that we're not so vulnerable to these hybrid warfare scenarios, the cyber attacks, the aggressive intelligence campaigns, the critical infrastructure protection. You know all about this. Can you give the listeners a sort of a sense of where you feel that Europe is good at this at the moment, and which sort of improvements you've identified as you've done your work?
Yeah, first of all, where European Union is strong, well, economically, surely, and with possibility of having resources. With possibility of having resources also for security reasons. The weaknesses are, I would say, we need a new attitude, a new mindset to people to understand how important security is, and with that take our resources to serve that purpose. It should be taken a lot more seriously. We have problems in recruiting people to security, career, armies, and so on.
Yeah.
Trying to improve that, but behind that is that the knowledge of threats has to be there, and will to solve them. What comes to EU NATO members, that is EU countries, must fulfill what they have promised to fulfill.
Yeah.
That is 2% and recruiting people to NATO. So I call it, in a way, more European NATO. Just the fact that we take our agreed share and burden. We have to understand that EU and NATO have to work together. NATO more on military side, but EU in a way complementing the role of NATO. You need a lot of civil protection, preparedness for military forces. All that kind of things must be discussed, and that, I guess, is starting with that task force, which I consider is most important.
Mr. President, one final sort of personal question,
Yes.
if you don't mind. I know that you are a dog lover. Harry Truman, the US president, famously said, if you want a friend in Washington,
Yes.
get a dog. Is that the same in Helsinki, that in politics a Finnish politician also needs dogs to have some good friends?
Not for that reason. We have good relations amongst politicians, believe or not. But when you go walking out in the evening, it's good to have company, and dogs are for that. Or I guess dog thinks that I'm for that.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you.
Well, Mr. President, all I can say as we come to the end of our conversation is that I used to be asked in the days when I was spokesman of NATO, will Sweden and Finland join? And I always used to say, no, they're very comfortable with non-alignment. There's a strong social consensus. They're in the EU. They've got lots of Nordic cooperation. They're NATO partners. They have everything they need. And it would be wonderful to see them as allies. We would be the beneficiary here at NATO, but I don't see them taking on the job. So, Mr. President, that's why I've been put in charge of a history podcast, because my reputation looking backwards is better than my ability to predict things. But it did happen after all. For NATO having these two countries with their military capabilities, which are very, very serious, their esprit de défense, ability to defend themselves, a strong commitment to democratic values, strong commitment to shared burdens, has been really one of the best sort of news stories, I think, that we've had in recent years. So I'm very happy, and I think our listeners will be, to have heard from you today that it's obviously been good for NATO, but you think it's been good for Finland as well. And thank you on behalf of everybody here in this building and all our listeners for the personal role, because it's not as easy as sometimes it looks retrospectively, but the personal role that you've played in making it all happen, being such a great European and such a great Atlanticist. It's been a pleasure to host you, Mr. President, and good luck with all of your future endeavours. It's good to know that retired presidents remain extremely active former presidents.
Thank you. It has been a great pleasure to discuss with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, dear listeners, I hope, like me, that you enjoyed the conversation with former President Niinistö of Finland and his reflections on why Finland chose to join NATO, finally, and its path towards that ultimate NATO membership. I mean, what struck me was, of course, this notion that Finland is a country strongly attached to Western values and strongly attached to its defence, its freedom and its sovereignty. And it's a country that has fought numerous wars, particularly in the 20th century, and paid a great price to uphold that freedom and sovereignty. And I think one of the most interesting remarks is when he said that Russia suddenly decided to try to take away that sovereignty by imposing its will on Finland, and that was a step too far. And then the Finns decided that in order to preserve their freedom, they had to come to NATO. That desire for freedom is also the basis of the strong defence, the conscription, the 900,000 reservists that have been in the Finnish army, that concept of armed neutrality, which has certainly benefited NATO because it means that Finland brings a lot of modern equipment, not just US fighter aircraft, but lots of other types of equipment and highly trained soldiers and brigades into NATO, particularly at a time when obviously that's good for NATO's collective defence. I was also interested in what he said about recreating a security culture, a security mindset in Europe, understanding the risks much more soberly among our public opinion and making the security profession a more attractive one for our citizens as well. And then finally, the notion that when it comes to dealing with at least a homeland security issues, resilience, cyber attacks, espionage, critical infrastructure protection, disinformation campaigns, the root is in NATO and the EU working more closely together, and the optimism that after so many of us talking about this in Brussels for many, many years and saying it should happen, we now have leaders in NATO and the EU sitting down with each other, making sure that it's going to happen. So thank you again. This is Jamie Shea, former NATO official. It's been, as on previous occasions, my pleasure to host the podcast today. I hope that those of you who are our regulars will stay tuned for our next podcast coming before too long. And those of you who are listening for the first time will feel sufficiently motivated to check out the previous podcasts in this series. But for now, from NATO headquarters in Brussels, goodbye.